Hi there, I'm Miles Parks. I cover voting and election security for NPR, and I'm here with Shawn Henry, who's the president of CrowdStrike Services and also a Global Cyber Alliance board member. We're going to have a little conversation about election security in 2020. I can't really think of many people in this country who know this topic more than you, Shawn. So I'm happy you're joining me here.
Thanks, Miles. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's a really important issue, particularly now as we're moving into election season in the coming months.
Yeah, and you think about I just think about 5 years ago, 2014, 2015, 2016, how little people were talking about cybersecurity when it comes to elections. Obviously, that's not the case now. There's a lot more awareness that this is an issue and could potentially be an issue in 2020. But can you kind of lay out the landscape in terms of how much have things improved since 2016 on a cybersecurity perspective?
Yeah, it's a great place to start, but let me take you back even further because you talk about 2016, but I actually was the deputy assistant director of the cyber division at the FBI in 2008, and we identified the Chinese government that had accessed both the Obama and the McCain campaigns in terms of looking to collect intelligence that would help them understand the candidates' policies and their economic values, et cetera. So this is not something new. This is something that has been going on. We would have expected or should have expected, I think, into 2016 that we'd have a better sense. But I think now, as we fast forward to 2020 and where we're going in November coming up here, I think there absolutely is a greater awareness. But that awareness needs to translate to action. In other words, it's good that people know and they recognize that we have a widely dispersed electoral system. The infrastructure is widely dispersed. We've got thousands of different municipalities and small towns and cities and counties, states that are running independent election systems. And because of that somewhat disparate system, it creates challenges in terms of securing. So the fact that people have an awareness, that's a great start. But the second part of that, and the most important part really is how do we execute on that? How do we, now that we've identified that there's risk, how do we mitigate the risk? And I think that's the area where organizations need to be thinking today, because the adversaries are not going away. In fact, I would argue that with the success of what's occurred in previous campaigns in terms of adversary access, and collecting intelligence, that there will be other nation states who will use that vector as part of their tool set because they saw what happened and they'll see it again going forward. And let me just add before I jump, when we talk about the landscape, the threat landscape, what we saw in the U.S. has been replicated around the globe. We've seen similar types of reconnaissance and theft of intelligence related to the electoral process in other countries, in Israel and Germany and France, the Ukraine, and elsewhere. So this is not something that is relevant specifically to the United States, but rather a global issue, particularly against democratic countries and systems.
I think when people think about 2016, obviously a lot of the conversation has centered around Russia. I'm curious, first off, have the Russians just decided they had a great time in 2016 and they're not going to try it again? And then, second of all, what other countries could be at play here other than Russia without getting tunnel vision on Russia? Like you mentioned, there's other adversaries who could have an interest in American elections.
Yeah, I think we have to take that broad stance and not focus on a particular country, but just on the fragility of the system generally, and the fact that there are lots of adversaries who may look to disrupt the system, and quite honestly, beyond nation states. We've heard recently with some of the unrest in U.S. cities about anarchists, and we saw disruption and destruction in certain cities in the physical world. You've got to understand from a security perspective that the cyber vector is just one tool in an adversary's toolbox, and that those that may look to disrupt democracy will look to cyber as a vector. So you might have organized crime groups trying to disrupt the election process using ransomware because they're going to capitalize on it financially. You might find hacktivist groups who are not sympathetic to the way certain things have been handled in certain local governments and might look to target that local election system. You might find those who are the antithesis of democracy and are looking to disrupt the system or to encumber the system solely for their social gains, their political gains. So I think we have to take it out of the context of purely nation state, although that still is probably one of the primary vectors, and it moves to many nation states who've seen what's happened previously and can use this to their advantage. But beyond that, to organized crime groups, hacktivist groups, anarchy groups, and those that would look to harm not just the U.S., but Western democracy, Miles.
I wonder about, obviously, there are so many, when you talk about a local elections office and how many different threat vectors there could be, ways that an adversary could potentially sow chaos. How do you prioritize that as a local election official? When I'm obviously the GCA has done a great job with this handbook, giving local election officials a number of things that they can kind of break all of this stuff down to 9 kind of easy categories. But can you
Right.
kind of talk through that a little bit on how local election officials should be what they should be prioritizing when it
Yep.
comes to securing their systems?
Sure. When I think about the electoral system, I think about the major components. I would categorize them in 4 major components. There are actually more, but just at a broad level, there's the voter registration piece. There's the vote casting piece. There is the tabulation piece, and then there's the reporting piece, the dissemination of the results. That's again at a high level. There are other components that might be derivative or subcomponents of those 4 that I mentioned. But when I think about that, if I'm thinking as an election official, where do I need to prioritize? The reality is an adversary, if they want to disrupt or they want to impact or influence, they can do it anywhere along that chain. So you can't look at one of those independently. You've really got to look at the totality of the infrastructure. So as an election official, thinking about security, you've got to take stock in where your assets are. The toolkit that GCA has put out really looks at how do you secure that broad infrastructure that I just described, regardless of what those components are. The very first one is inventory of assets. Really important. You can't secure what you can't see. If you don't know what's out there, if there are pieces of equipment that are unmanaged, they're unprotected, and you don't know about them, they're an ingress into the system. But thinking about those 4 components, there's hardware, there's software, there are people that make up the infrastructure, the delivery, and the security of those 4 components. One of the main pieces in any cybersecurity program is really kind of the health of the system. And the GCA toolkit really looks across those 9 toolboxes that you mentioned. I mentioned the first one, how do you secure your assets? But how do you configure the system? How do you control access to the systems? How do you ensure that the software and the hardware are patched and that the existing vulnerabilities are such so that they can't be exploited? How do you control via usernames and passwords? Do you have dual factor authentication? Are you using antivirus? And how are you filtering DNS traffic and preventing phishing, which is still probably one of the biggest injects into a system today? So there are a whole host of things that GCA provides to people for free, these toolkits, to the disparate systems around the country, around the world. And the toolkit really focuses on the basic component of cybersecurity, which is the health and maintenance of the system. Do we have a system free of vulnerabilities that can be exploited? Do we have a system in place to monitor and log and look for anomalous behavior? That, for me, as an election official who's looking to secure the system, it starts right there. Do we know what we have? Are we healthy? And do we have visibility into what we're required to protect?
A lot of the conversation around election security, I'm in Washington. A lot of the conversation here on the Capitol focuses on resources and just constantly talking about how local election administrators don't have enough money, they need more money, or whether then that's a constant debate. But there's a lot of organizations that have sprouted up that are, like you said, offering this sort of help. That this is a free toolkit. Can you talk a little bit about the role that organizations like GCA play in this election security landscape? Uh, can you talk a little bit, I guess, about how GCA plays into this landscape?
Yeah, no, great question. And the reason I joined GCA is because the opportunity to give back and to offer capabilities and services and tools to those who typically don't have the resources to fight against a determined adversary who is incredibly sophisticated and has untold resources at their disposal. How do you help the little guy, if you will, or those that don't have the necessary funding? GCA is about uniting stakeholders to reduce cyber risk around the world, and really building the solutions that help to eradicate that risk at scale, and to do it in a way that's free. I think that other organizations that are in play that have come to the forefront, offering similar types of services or capabilities, really to help to secure all the various components of the internet around the world. When you think about security, the infrastructure is a network, and it requires the compatibility, the collaboration, the interconnectivity of all of these devices. That's how it functions. That's what a network is. And we all are essentially subjected to be the weakest link in the chain. So groups like GCA and others that have come forward, helping those who might not have the resources or the capability, the technical proficiency to become more established, to protect their own domains, to ensure their perimeters are secure, their assets and resources are patched, etc. It helps everybody. A rising tide raises all ships, and I think that really is kind of the basic premise for GCA and others who've come forward to try and help these organizations better protect themselves long term, not just election, but long term.
Is this a problem that's going away after 2020 in terms of our election security? I think this election has gotten so much media attention because it will be the first presidential election since the now famous 2016 attacks. But is this something that is just the new future of how elections are going to be run?
Yeah, it absolutely is a new future. You talk about 2016, but we know that there was adversary activity in 2018 in various states, not a presidential election, but congressional districts and other local elections. But look again. This is the tool that is in, or the weapon, I should say, in an adversary's quiver. It's another arrow, and it allows them to operate at scale remotely, with oftentimes a small chance of being caught. So there's not a lot of deterrence, and it's incredibly effective. So as we go forward, I see this continued, and the ability for organizations to protect their environments, to identify adversary activity, and then to disrupt that adversary activity so they can mitigate the consequences of the attack. They have to focus there, because without that, we will see negative impacts, and we will see adversaries influence and/or disrupt our process, and that's just not acceptable.
Can we talk a little bit about campaign? The campaign arm is also a part of election infrastructure. It's not necessarily up to the local election officials to protect those campaigns directly, but they definitely have a stake in making sure that that campaign data is safe. Do you feel like campaigns are better equipped in 2020 than they were in 2016?
Again, I think the awareness is there. Whether that awareness translates to execution is another story. I know some campaigns that have absolutely taken these types of issues seriously. They've implemented appropriate technology and capabilities and brought on experts to help them prepare and protect against adversary activities. So certainly, but I don't know that it's happened broadly to the level that's required. As I said, this is an issue that's not going away. In fact, it's increasing. It's going to continue to increase. And as long as there are campaigns or parts of the infrastructure that are underprepared, we will see adversary success in exploitation. And anytime you touch and are able to either influence, disrupt, pilfer data, you're going to enter, whether rightfully or wrongly, you're going to enter both confusion and credibility into the process. And that's unfortunate, because even sometimes if something were disrupted, it doesn't mean that there's been anything that has been influenced, but it certainly could raise that question. And I think as part of a democratic society, we expect free and fair elections and free and fair from influence. And entering that lack of credibility or confusion or just a question, I think, is a problem for folks in a democratic society. So you've got to have the campaigns protected in order to maintain that integrity.
It's impossible to have this conversation right now without talking about the pandemic. Obviously, you can see my living room behind me. Everyone's working from home, and I imagine that's the case in a lot of local election offices as well. Can you talk about how the pandemic affects election security in 2020?
So I'll talk about the pandemic broadly, how it's impacted security, and then that trickles down. It's just kind of a mirror. The election system is a microcosm of what we're seeing broadly. Adversaries have increased their targeting as people have moved remotely. They're off of the traditional security stack, and they're using home routers and in many cases unpatched systems or legacy operating systems that haven't been updated recently, which are all susceptible to exploitation. So that in the broader infrastructure, we've seen adversaries targeting increase because of that. I think if you then kind of migrate to the question about the election system, it's very, very similar. You've got folks that are, in many cases, they're working for government agencies. They've been told to work from home. They're off the corporate stack. They may not have the technical proficiency to adequately secure their devices. They may not have the understanding. When there's a small presumption, I guess, or a greater level of confidence when somebody's inside the perimeter, that there's somebody there who has a good understanding. That's a general thought. It certainly changes from place to place, but I think it increases a lot more complexity and just another vector for adversaries to target. And I think, again, this awareness piece for people to understand that they've got to be judicious, they've got to be aware, they've got to be monitoring their systems. It's even more important now when they are cast about to these to their homes and off-premise locations because of COVID-19. That is not an enviable position to be in, Miles.
We touched on it a little bit, but I'm hoping we can kind of zoom in. Phishing attacks were a huge part of the attacks in 2016, and I'm just curious on that specific front. Is there something that you can tell election officials that they can be doing, today or tomorrow that can help protect against phishing attacks?
Yeah, well, one of the tools, first of all, in the election toolkit is DMARC, which allows organizations to prevent phishing attacks and reputational harm through email compromise. And it's just, again, one of a number of tools that will help them in this space. But this awareness piece, if you know that you're likely to be targeted, it should raise the visibility and that awareness level, right? So getting unusual unusual emails from people you don't know, or questions, links in messages. Adversaries have to exploit code on your box, on your computer, and they'll do it by trojanizing a Word document or a PDF, or putting a link which causes when you click on it, causes that code to execute. So if you're aware of that, that's going to be helpful. But certainly having the appropriate filters to minimize those that do get through is going to be a big help in mitigating phishing attacks, Miles.
I'm wondering about communication too, because I know that your company doesn't specifically work on disinformation issues, but it is kind of a theme around a lot of cybersecurity issues when you talk about elections, obviously. Is there any guidance that you can give for election officials on how to better improve their communications around cybersecurity, and if they are potentially breached or think they could potentially be breached, how to communicate around that?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, I think that the Department of Homeland Security has been very forward-leaning in this space in terms of collaborating with election systems around the country and ensuring that they're sharing intelligence on emerging threats, on new technologies and techniques, but beyond that, trying to provide some level of fidelity on the information that's being shared. So when I think about misinformation, campaigns related to misinformation, I think that it comes down to not only the election officials, but consumers understanding where you're getting your information from. So if you're going to DHS, trusted government source, that's a good start. Beyond that, when you think about mainstream media or social media, what are the trusted sources? And can you trust but verify? So it's a trusted source. Can you get a secondary source? And not that it's a derivative of the first source, because that's not helpful, or it's not circular reporting. But that is absolutely one of the huge pieces I think we're going to see going forward. Not just exploitation of networks, not the theft of data, not the manipulation of actual data on the box, but the manipulation of information that is being viewed by the public to try to influence people, to change their thoughts, to encourage them or discourage them. We've seen that in the physical world. So we've seen this type of misinformation via social media by nation state adversaries in the physical world. So as it relates to the Black Lives Matter movement and other types of protests that we've seen adversaries that have put out misinformation. You take that same concept in the physical world, you migrate it to the electoral process, and it's been valuable. They've seen a big return on their investment. It causes disruption, chaos, confusion. That's exactly what adversaries want to do. And as they push that out, it factors into their success rate. And I think as consumers of news, of media, as government officials monitoring and administering networks, we've got to be absolutely aware of who's saying what, how are they saying it, what's their objective, because that is, to me, the kind of the amplifier, and that goes towards the very crux of what our adversaries want to do to achieve their objectives. So confusion and doubt and distrust.
I guess finally, can we just talk a little bit about how you're feeling this year in terms of where the state of election security is? You've watched this space for over a decade. How are you feeling in terms of confidence about the security of the 2020 election?
It goes, I've said this a couple times here today. The awareness is there for sure, but the awareness does nothing unless there's execution. I'm aware that you shouldn't spend a lot of time out in the sun, but if you don't, because it can cause skin cancer. But if you don't put on sunblock and you don't go see a dermatologist on a regular basis to get checked, you don't wear the right type of clothing, it doesn't matter how aware I am if I don't execute it. And I'm concerned that there may not be enough execution, which is why I'm so honored to be associated with GCA, that they are putting out free tools, no cost. There's lots of great instruction. You go to the GCA Global Cybersecurity Alliance.org, and you can download the information. There's great instructions there. If you are aware, that's great. Great first step. Second step is take actions. And if you don't take actions, shame on you. I'd rather not know and fail than to know and fail, because that is a lack of responsibility. It is it's irresponsible and it's unacceptable. So I hope that those that do have an awareness, if they see that there's risk there, that they take the necessary actions to mitigate that risk and to play their role. If you've taken on the responsibility to administer the election system, then you better take that responsibility seriously. And your failure to protect that infrastructure could be a failure in democracy. And I don't know how I'd be able to live with myself if I allowed that to happen willingly and knowingly.
Yeah. All right. Well, Shawn Henry, board member on the Global Cyber Alliance and president of CrowdStrike Services, thank you so much.
Thanks, Miles.